When U.S. President Donald Trump first threatened Canadian sovereignty, few, if any, of Canada's allies came to its defense publicly. But this week, French President Emmanuel Macron brought it up as an example of the U.S. turning away from its allies and breaking international norms.
Canada is a reliable, trustworthy, and strong partner of France.
Breaking news. Moments ago, behind closed doors in Ottawa and Brussels, a set of decisions quietly crossed a line that had defined the Atlantic world for decades. This did not arrive with a press conference or a dramatic announcement. It arrived through coordinated statements, finalized frameworks, and procedural votes that signal something far more permanent. Canada and Europe have now aligned in a way that formally excludes the United States from key coordination roles, and the timing is not accidental. By the time Washington began reacting, the architecture was already locked in. This shift was foreshadowed earlier this week when senior European officials, speaking not to the public but to diplomatic corps and institutional partners, described the United States as an established power turning inward, distancing itself from shared rules and long-standing guarantees. Those remarks were delivered in Paris and Berlin, not as rhetoric, but as guidance. Within 24 hours, Canadian officials echoed the same assessment in Ottawa, using nearly identical language about predictability, reliability, and long-term planning. In international politics, that alignment of vocabulary is rarely spontaneous. It is preparatory. What followed was not one decision, but a sequence. On January 9th, Canada formally signed into an expanded strategic coordination framework with the European Union covering trade resilience, industrial supply chains, and regulatory alignment in critical sectors. The document does not mention the United States by name, but it removes the automatic assumption of North American integration that has underpinned Canadian policy since the early 1990s. 2 days later, European ministers approved a parallel defense industrial coordination mechanism that lists Canada as a preferred external partner, granting access to joint procurement discussions previously limited to EU member states and select European allies. The United States was not included. Individually, each move could be explained as technical. Together, they form a pattern. Canada and Europe are building redundancy without Washington. They are standardizing rules without American input. They are coordinating procurement, trade defense, and industrial planning on timelines that extend 10 and 20 years into the future. This is not a response to a single administration. It is a structural hedge. The numbers explain why this matters. The European Union and Canada now represent a combined market of more than 480 million people, with a GDP exceeding $22 trillion. Under the revised alignment, over 90% of industrial goods traded between them will operate under harmonized regulatory standards. That reduces dependence on US-based certification systems, American dispute resolution channels, and dollar-denominated settlement mechanisms. These are not symbolic changes. They directly affect where factories are built, which ports expand, and how capital is allocated. Defense planning follows the same logic. Over the past year, European defense spending has risen above 2% of GDP across most member states, generating procurement volumes that rival those of the United States. Canada's entry into coordinated planning allows European defense industries to treat Canadian firms as internal partners rather than external suppliers. Once that supply chain integration occurs, it does not revert easily. Tooling, workforce training, and logistics networks are designed for permanence, not electoral cycles. Washington was not unaware of these discussions. U.S. officials were briefed on early consultations last autumn when Canada and Europe framed the talks as complementary to existing transatlantic structures. The assumption in Washington was that alignment would remain informal, consultative, and ultimately reversible. That assumption proved decisive. While U.S. policymakers debated tariff leverage and bilateral pressure points, institutional momentum built elsewhere. Trade policy accelerated the divergence. Following renewed tariff uncertainty and regulatory unpredictability from Washington, Canada invoked domestic emergency provisions to remove remaining internal trade barriers between its provinces, explicitly citing the need to integrate more deeply with stable external partners. Europe responded by fast-tracking mutual recognition clauses that had been stalled for years. The speed of that response surprised even senior European officials. It reflected readiness. Polling data supports the political sustainability of this shift. In Canada, recent surveys show a majority of respondents now rank economic diversification away from the United States as a national priority, even at the cost of short-term adjustment. In Europe, trust in U.S. leadership on trade and security has fallen below levels recorded during previous transatlantic crises, while support for autonomous coordination has reached record highs. These attitudes shape policy durability. Governments rarely reverse strategies that align with public consensus across multiple election cycles. The United States, meanwhile, finds itself responding after the fact. Statements from Washington emphasize continued partnership and shared values, but they arrive in an environment where procedural doors have already closed. Once regulatory standards diverge, re-entry requires renegotiation. Once procurement frameworks exclude a partner, inclusion requires unanimous consent. Once institutions adapt to new coordination habits, reverting imposes costs that few governments are willing to pay. This is why officials in Ottawa and Brussels describe the shift as defensive. From their perspective, it is not an act of opposition, but of insulation. They are designing systems that function regardless of policy volatility in Washington. That distinction matters because it removes emotional drivers and replaces them with technical ones. Technical systems persist. The personal dimension cannot be ignored, but it is not decisive. Donald Trump's return to confrontational trade language and conditional alliance commitments accelerated timelines, but it did not invent the trend. European strategic autonomy debates predate him. Canadian diversification strategies began years ago. What changed in the past week is that these parallel trajectories converged into formal alignment. Financial markets have already adjusted. Cross-Atlantic investment flows between Canada and Europe increased sharply following the announcement of the new frameworks, while Canadian exposure to U.S.-centric supply chains declined. Insurers and logistics firms are pricing in long-term rerouting of trade flows. These are not speculative reactions. They are responses to institutional signals. The most consequential aspect is what did not happen. There was no emergency summit to reassure Washington. No pause for consultation. No attempt to keep options open.